So, I decided to do this season's fashionable COVID-19 reading, which is Albert Camus' The Plague. Very apt uh, for the process of the whole country and large portions of the world shutting down for disease. Also, I had seen that sales of The Plague dramatically increased recently, so this actually is the sort of fashionable fad reading of people trapped in their house to not get a disease. So Camus' novel is set in the town of Oran, which is in French colonial French colonial Algeria in the 1940s sometime. We think it's post World War II, but we don't have a specific date. A plague randomly starts. It's not clear what's caused this. Just the novel begins with tons and tons and tons and tons of rats dying off. Like a few rats at first, and then truckloads of rats, basically, just dying en masse in this city. And then people start dying. A few people at first, and they're not the officials are not sure what is going on. There's one doctor who has lived through outbreaks of plague before, and he says that he's sure what it is, but the other doctors, especially some of the sort of higher ranking officialdom type doctors, are reluctant to announce that this is an outbreak of plague until it becomes absolutely clear that that's what it is. At which point the city officials, the prefect, is finally goaded into action, and they end up shutting down the city. Complete shutdown. The gates are the gates of the city are closed because this is back in the sort of walled city, old world type situation. There are no ships coming in, no planes are landing, no trains are running. People are just in this city, and they can't effectively fight this plague. Like, the doctors do everything in their power. They try and treat it as best they can with the limited supplies that they have. Some supplies, anti-plague serums and things like that, are sort of airdropped in from Paris, but it's nowhere near enough. And at some point they're getting hundreds of deaths a day because they simply can't stop this plague. Much of the city goes into a sort of plague production type situation where various public buildings, various large buildings like monasteries, the football or soccer stadium, get converted into facilities to deal with plague victims or to isolate people, family members of people who've been diagnosed with plague. And eventually, the plague just tapers off. And there's no real explanation for that either. At one point, I think Camus writes that the plague ended as mysteriously as it began. And so that's one of the elements of Camus' absurdism here. So Albert Camus is probably the primary theorist of absurdist philosophy, which is an offshoot of existentialism. And Camus' sort of main theorization of this philosophy is in his long essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, in which he ponders the question, should one commit suicide in the face of the utter pointlessness of human existence? And ultimately, Camus comes to the conclusion that you shouldn't commit suicide, not because suicide is in and of itself bad, but because it's an act of moral cowardice. And what the ethical position that Camus advocates is to recognize that existence is absurd, to recognize that there's a gap between the utter pointlessness of existence and our human intuition to strive for meaning, to strive for purpose. So we have to, according to Camus, recognize that existence is absurd, that it's fundamentally pointless, even though everything in our human psychological makeup tells us that there should be some point. We have to embrace that, and we have to go on as though we are making meaning. So that's essentially what the Myth of Sisyphus argues, and we see that in a lot of Camus' novels, including The Plague, including The Stranger, L'Étranger. We often get a figure of an absurd hero. In The Stranger, it's Marceau. In The Plague, it's the Dr. Rio, who's the sort of main protagonist, the one that the novel primarily follows. And we get, and so one to sort of backtrack slightly, one element of Camus' absurdism that we get in the novel is that the plague just happens. There's no lesson to it. It doesn't come from anywhere as far as we know. It simply occurs. The universe is vast and uncaring, and that's sort of the existentialist component of absurdist philosophy, is that fundamentally existence does not care about human beings. It doesn't care about the things that we want. It doesn't care about the things that are important to us. Stuff just happens. And there's no point to it. There's no reason for it, etc., etc. But we've also got the figure of the absurdist hero who recognizes the pointlessness of struggling against the meaninglessness of existence, and yet is committed to doing it anyway. And so we get that with a number of figures who often have these sort of bizarre minor quirks or characteristics that they focus their identity on in their quest for meaning. But we get it most overtly with Rio. So I'm just going to read a couple of the things that he says that'll give you a sense of this. One of the things that Camus says of Rio is that plague had broken out and he could only do what had to be done. So this notion that Rio knows that he can't actually save people, he can't actually defeat the plague, and yet he dedicates almost every waking moment to struggling against it. We also have this description of him fighting against creation as he found it. So again, this notion like he's not going to defeat the plague. The plague simply exists. It's not in and of itself purposeful or intelligent, even though Camus often talks about it as though it's intelligent, but it simply exists. It is part of the universe, and Rio struggles against it. we also get this passage here where he's talking to this other guy, Tarot, who's he's a stranger to this city. Like, this is not his native city, and he's this sort of detached observer for much of the novel. And parts of the novel actually consist of passages taken from his diaries, but Tarot says, "Since the order of the world is shaped by death, mightn't it be better for God if we refused to believe in him and struggle with all our might against death without raising our eyes toward the heaven where he sits?" Rio says that to Tarot. And then Tarot nods. And he says, "Yes, but your victories will never be lasting, that's all." Rio's face darkened. "Yes, I know that, but it's no reason for giving up the struggle." Tarot says, "No reason, I agree, only I now can picture what this plague must mean for you." And Rio says, "Yes, a never-ending defeat." So this is the sort of absurdist condition, and it's not necessarily all that pleasant. Rio would clearly not have chosen this out of all possible scenarios in the world, but this is the sort of encapsulation of the absurd hero, is that sort of recognition that it's pointless to struggle, and yet the ethical position is to continue struggling, not because you will succeed, but simply because that's the thing to do. And I want to just read one more passage here, because I think it's really interesting. Bureaucrats often get a bad rep, and that's not necessarily unjustified in some cases, but there's something perversely absurdist about the bureaucrats in this novel. So there's another character named Rambert who is trying to get out of the city, desperately trying to get out of the city because he's in love with this woman who's back in his hometown. He's not from Oran either. And so his first course of action, Rambert's first course of action, is to go to the officials and try and persuade them to give him a pass to let him out of the city after it's been quarantined. And there's this passage that I really like, which goes, "The really remarkable thing, and Rambert was greatly struck by this, was the way in which, in the very midst of catastrophe, offices could go on functioning serenely and take initiatives of no immediate relevance, and often unknown to the highest authority, purely and simply because they had been created originally for this purpose." So, on the one hand, I think Camus is sort of mocking bureaucracy, because he doesn't strike me as someone who would be in favor of bureaucracy. But at the same time, the bureaucrats are these sort of perverse existential heroes who go on doing the pointless things that their offices are set up to do simply because their offices are set up to do them. There's no sort of question of whether it's beneficial, whether it should be done, whether or not the higher-ups actually want them to continue doing these things. It's almost this sort of automatic process. And so I think it's a delightful little moment in what's otherwise a really, really depressing novel. Thanks.